When talking about Rome, we tend to distinguish between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. It's important to understand what the differences are between those two historical periods. So we've talked about the Roman Republic, and now we're going to move into the Roman Empire. And as we talked about at the end of the Roman Republic, at the end of the section on the Roman Republic, what we see happening is we see in Rome a decline in the values of Rome. And by decline, what I mean by that is that we see changes in Roman society that are undermining those core Roman values that enabled them to build their empire in the first place. An example of that would be the development of these new client armies whose allegiances were primarily to a particular general rather than to the Roman Republic. And so this is one of those instances, one of those pieces of evidence that we use to support the idea that the Roman Republic is declining, and we're seeing a new political system take place. What's interesting about this is, and we'll talk about this more, is that even as those Republican ideals were being subverted in Roman society, Romans themselves still continue to talk about Rome as a republic, even as their leaders stopped acting in ways that were consistent with those Republican ideals, even as the political power of the people was declining. And so it's interesting to note that Romans themselves still clung to this idea of a Roman Empire to the extent that even the leaders, knowing full well that this was no longer the republic that had historically exhibited certain characteristics, they still as well talked about Rome as a republic. It was a way of legitimizing and a way of linking themselves to the past. Now, in the wake of Caesar's assassination, Mark Antony and Caesar's nephew Octavian began to compete for power, and this turned into a pretty bloody civil war. Octavian gained the support of the military by promising them a share of Caesar's wealth. If you'll recall, Octavian was, I guess you could call him Caesar's heir. He'd been adopted by Caesar. And Octavian also forced the Senate to make him a consul. For a while, Octavian and Antony put aside their differences. They were able to get along and work for the greater good, so to speak. And along with a third general named Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. They used their power to proscribe their enemies and confiscate their property. So very much this was a political alliance that benefited them for the time being. Eventually, however, Antony and Octavian forced Lepidus into retirement, and they turned on each other. Antony and Octavian fought a civil war, with Antony controlling the eastern provinces of the empire as well as Egypt. Octavian used the relationship between Antony and his lover, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII, to convince many Romans to take a loyalty oath to him out of fear of a foreign queen. So what we see happening is that Octavian is able to wage this propaganda war, and he's able to call up the fears of Romans that Mark Antony intended to put Cleopatra in as queen of Rome. And these are worries that were held over from her relationship with Caesar as well. After suffering a defeat at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony fled to Egypt. Both of them committed suicide in 30 BCE, and this essentially ended the conflict. Octavian relinquished power to the Senate, and the Senate then in turn favored him with the name Augustus. Now that Octavian was Augustus, he did not make himself a king, but he took the old republican title princeps. Princeps meant first man among equals in Rome. And in doing so, he was maintaining the facade of Republican continuity. The Senate and other traditional offices were maintained, but in reality, Augustus controlled both the army and the treasury. And as a result, he held a tribune's power without the formal office. So, if you'll remember from our discussion of the Roman Republic, this would have been a big no-no. As both consul and tribune, Augustus avoided becoming a dictator and gave his political innovations legitimacy. Military power was the real foundation of his influence, and Augustus created a full-time army as well as a navy, and this army and this navy were paid for by new taxes. He established the several thousand-strong Praetorian Guard, and the Praetorian Guard was stationed in Rome to provide security for him and for the government. So essentially, this Praetorian Guard became his own personal security force. Using coinage, as well as road building and large public buildings, including Augustus's Forum, you might be familiar with the Forum in Rome, Augustus communicated power and moral authority throughout the empire to his subjects. So again, this is something that is a continuation of what was fairly standard practice under the Roman Republic. Augustus cultivated an image of himself as a stern but caring father of his country, and he sought to promote a sense of peace and security through Roman strength and devotion to the gods. And this was really appealing to Romans who really sought security, prosperity. They wanted to feel good about their government. And so what we see happening is that as Augustus is promoting this image of himself, it's enabling Romans to feel good about the changes in their political system, and this in turn led to less protests over changes. We don't know how Augustus understood his political innovations, but he sought to achieve stability, peace, and freedom for Roman citizens and to realize his own considerable ambitions. Augustus used traditional values to justify new ways of doing things, with himself as the father of his people. And this became such a prevalent image that the Senate actually proclaimed him father of his people in 2 BCE. Now, in Rome, cities were crowded, particularly Rome. Most Romans lived in small apartments in multi-story buildings. This was a really urbanized society. Although aqueducts provided good water, there were serious sanitation issues. Gender-segregated public baths were common, and they also contributed to the spread of disease. Public baths were it was a very social environment. People went there to socialize, and in doing so, spread disease quite rampantly throughout the city. And so communicable diseases were a real problem for Rome. Augustus focused on improving urban life and public safety, and he developed both fire and police services. This is an interesting innovation. Wealthy residents enjoyed houses built around courtyards and gardens. The government imported grain, which they distributed to some 700,000 of the poorer residents of Rome, and this is one of those programs that Augustus used to appease the people. As Rome is becoming more and more occupied by a large number of poor, one of the ways that he keeps the peace in his city is by distributing grain, and it came to be an expectation. A falling birth rate among the social elite led to government policies favoring larger families. So the government is deliberately undertaking a program of encouraging elites to have more children. Adultery was discouraged by law, but most senatorial families disappeared as they failed to reproduce, and so this is a real problem for Rome. Equestrians and provincial elites were incorporated into the Roman elite by winning the emperor's favor. So as we see, this is providing some opportunities as these elite families are dying out. This is providing opportunities for other up-and-coming elites to replace them. The Roman willingness to make freed slaves citizens and even eventually members of the social elite contributed to a sense of hope among slaves, most of whom were taken captive in war or were born into slave families. Slave Slave lives varied, and it very much depended on their occupation. But agricultural and mining slaves faced really grueling conditions, with household slaves faring better, pretty significantly better. Slaves had no legal rights in relation to their masters. Now, you're probably familiar with gladiator games, with some of the events that occurred in the Colosseum, and these were often very violent public entertainment events, and they were sponsored by the emperor. They could feature mock battles, hunts of wild animals, male and female gladiator combat, as well as the killing by various means of condemned criminals. These are all things that could happen in the Colosseum or in some of the other venues throughout the city. And this was a very prominent feature of public life in Rome. Now, this is an artist's rendering of the Forum of Augustus. And so it's just a good, gives you a good view of what that might have looked like at the time. You can see a lot of open space. You have the Temple of Mars Ultor. Remember, just like the Greeks, religion in Rome was not necessarily a congregationalist experience. This was not a religion in which people gathered together in a building to listen to sermons. This is very much practice and ritual, things of that nature. Sorry, not practice and ritual, but ritual and festivals, as well as the presence of individual shrines in people's homes. You can also see from this photo how much of Greek culture the Romans are integrating into their own society. So even though the Romans might have viewed Greeks themselves with some disdain, they really appreciated Greek culture and adopted some of those aspects into their own building programs and believed that it beautified their public spaces. And so this is an example of a piece of artwork that would have been in probably an elite person's home. And I want you to take a look at the content of it, because it's really an interesting picture of what life in Rome was like. This is called Gladiator After a Kill. It's a mosaic, so these are a lot of little tiles that are pieced together to form this picture. And it took a lot of skill to produce this. So what I want you to think about is, how does this mosaic highlight the importance of gladiators and spectacle in Roman life? Now, something you might think about is that this mosaic is a rather detailed portrayal. It's quite large. It would have cost a lot. And the central position in a wealthy person's home means that this would have been a theme most people could identify with and understand. And so having been in a central place in a person's home would have meant that it would have been viewed by anybody visiting that home, and it would have been something that resonated with visitors to the home as well as those who lived in the home themselves. How does this mosaic portray ambivalence about violence in gladiatorial contests? This is a death scene. So it's really interesting that this would have been the centerpiece of a home. The fighter himself looks pretty stunned, perhaps even saddened, about having killed the other man. This suggests that dying in these contests was rare, and that violence was thus acceptable to a point, but not beyond. Now, in Rome, there was no free public education. This is a very modern innovation. So the poor themselves received no formal education. Most education was practical. Servants taught wealthier boys and girls basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Advanced study for a few might include grammar, history, and literature, and for even fewer, rhetoric, philosophy, law, and dialectic. These subjects would have been reserved for those who were going to be the future leaders of Rome. So we see a variety of education going on in Rome, depending very much on a person's class and status. During Augustus's rule, Education continued in its traditional forms, but oratory, literature, and sculpture were now used for legitimizing and supporting the new principate. Writers and artists were patronized by the wealthy, including the emperor. The poets Horace and Virgil, for example, were Augustus's favorites, and Virgil composed the Aeneid, an epic poem about Rome's mythical founder. Other writers such as Livy, you've read Livy's recording of the rape of Lucretia. He was a historian, and Ovid, who was a poet. Livy and Ovid were more directly critical of the new political and moral order. So there was some room for criticism in the Roman Empire, particularly among those who were not directly sponsored by the emperor or by those in power. At Augustus's direction, portraits and sculpture became more idealized and less realistic. That's an interesting development, considering what we saw developing between the classical Greek period into the Hellenized kingdoms. We saw much more emotion among the Hellenistic kingdoms, but now Rome is going back to a more idealized style. And what we actually see happening is that Rome will copy a lot of these classical Greek sculptures. So just as I believe I said this in the last lecture, that a lot of the reasons why we know what Greek sculpture looked like is because Rome copied Greek sculpture so prolifically. So even we may not even have the original Greek statues, but we do have Roman copies. In 14 CE, after Augustus's death, Augustus's adopted son Tiberius became emperor with the support of the army. His succession strengthened the rule of the Praetorian Guard in succession, in deciding who would be the next princeps or the next Caesar. And it established the tradition of family dynasties ruling the restored republic of imperial Rome. So we're going to see dynasties now. During his 23-year reign, the principate continued, and the emperor ruled with the support of the elite, who received offices and prestige in return. Tiberius appointed the loyal but cruel and violent Caligula. Some of you might have heard of him. He was notorious. He was Augustus's great-grandson, and Tiberius appointed him to be his successor. Caligula was murdered by Praetorian commanders in 41 CE. They did this in order to avenge personal insults. So that's a lesson that you shouldn't insult the Praetorian Guard. They became increasingly important in deciding who would be the heir and in supporting the heir. It was really important for whoever was the heir that they didn't do anything to sort of tick off the Praetorian Guard. That could be death. Now, when the Senate considered restoring the Republic, Claudius, who was Augustus's grandnephew, bribed the Praetorian Guard into backing him. Claudius, who was an active emperor, and he conquered Britain in 43 CE, he also built loyalty by incorporating provincial elites into the government, and he employed freed slaves as important administrators. Claudius's teenage successor, Nero, loved music and theater more than governing, and he was an ineffective and corrupt ruler until his generals toppled his regime. This sparked a civil war, and Nero might be another emperor that you're familiar with, just because he was very known. He was well known for his cruelty and his brutality. Now, we have a struggle for power that results because of this civil war. And it occurred between four generals. It resulted in Vespasian becoming emperor in 69 CE, making it clear that the principate would continue because the military supported it. Naming the dynasty after his family, the Flavians, Vespasian encouraged the cult of the emperor. He was succeeded by his son Titus and Domitian, both of those, Titus and Domitian were both his sons, and they succeeded him. And they led military campaigns, balanced the budget, and engaged in public works before Domitian's repressive ways led his wife and members of his court to murder him in 96 CE. And so, a lot of this can be really confusing. We're talking about a lot of different emperors, and we're talking about a lot of intrigue. And so, make sure that you're just kind of familiar with what is going on in Rome and how the Roman emperor is functioning and how reliant he is on the support of others in order to preserve his own power. Rivalry among the elites and the danger of civil war persisted, and the Principate remained unstable, but 5 strong emperors, these included Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. These 5 strong emperors contributed to a Roman golden age. And that golden age was characterized by peaceful succession, a strong economy, and an obedient military. So this was an important time in the Roman Empire because it was a good time. It was remembered as being a good time. And so this is just another map of the expansion of the Roman Empire. So this is no longer the Roman Republic, and we can see some significant changes in what the empire looks like compared to the Roman Republic. So we can see that now they've gone further inland, they've taken over Britain, and it's becoming increasingly larger. So the peace and prosperity that characterized the Golden Age depended on defense by a local military. In theory, the Roman military goal was expansion. That would bring in money, land, and glory to Rome. But most military activity focused on defense and maintaining order. Trade expanded during this period. A military made up of diverse Romans and non-citizens was stationed on the frontier, and they played a role in spreading culture and a common way of life during these years of relative peace. Soldiers actually became citizens upon discharge. So this could be this was an avenue of achieving citizenship for people who were not necessarily Roman by birth. And it could also be a way of gaining some social status and prestige. The army in these years that weren't involved in as much conquest as had occurred previously became very expensive to maintain and pay, and this is going to cause a lot of pressure on Rome itself. A tax on agriculture in the provinces provided most of the revenue for the expenses of imperial administration and the army. Decurions, who were provincial elites, were charged with seeing to it that their area's financial responsibilities were met. They accepted these responsibilities in exchange for status and respect. Roman influence in a diverse range of some 40 provinces was centered in towns. Roman law and culture spread to the provinces, and peace and infrastructure increased agricultural productivity and trade. Romanization involved cultural interaction and the development of new mixed cultural traditions. And so if you'll recall from the section on the Roman Republic, I started off that lecture talking about the story of Masada and how the story of Josephus, the Romanized Jew, is a reflection of this practice of Rome to integrate cultures. And so this is continuing to occur throughout the Roman Empire. Greek language and culture also enriched Roman literature, including Lucian and his dialogues and Plutarch's biographies. Works such as Tacitus's histories and Juvenal's poetry were part of a silver age of Latin literature. An ordered Roman society offered important legal principles, including equity, the value of contracts, the presumption of innocence that became the foundation for later Western legal traditions. We get these things from Rome. Roman society remained strictly hierarchical. Roman law made distinctions based on rank and imposed harsher penalties on the humbler people. And so this is interesting considering that we've already seen that there was an alternative. If you'll recall, the Hebrews had a more equitable approach to dispensing justice, but Roman society did not share that view. Roman society was rife with anxiety about reproduction and maintaining a healthy population, so childbearing became an important social duty to the Romans. Girls usually married in their early teens, often in arranged marriages. Childbirth was dangerous for women, and many babies died young. Although infanticide and crude methods of contraception were practiced to control fertility, emperors tried to encourage fertility, and adoption was common among the wealthy. Okay, so we just have, this is just a map that kind of shows you some of the natural features and languages of the Roman world. And so if you take a look at it, you can see several lines. The line, I believe it's gray. On my screen it looks gray. Perhaps it's a light purple. But this is about as far north as vine growing for wine occurred. And so you're going to see some vine growing occurring in those areas. You can see where olive growing was prevalent from the green line. Anything below that, there was a pretty extensive olive culture, horticulture, and then we have date palm growing as well. That was another important crop, and that would be the orange line, and that was limited to Africa, to the continent of Africa. And then of course we see a lot of open desert. And you can see from the dots the distribution of cities. Now this is really interesting because what we're going to see happen later on in our studies is that there's going to be a collapse of urban society. Europe is going to return to a more rural type environment, and this is going to have significant impacts on the way that society functions throughout Europe. But during the Roman period, there were a lot of cities. This was a very urban society. And so we can see that especially in Italy and in Spain, especially along the Mediterranean, there were lots and lots of cities. And so one of the indicators that we see of Roman diffusion of culture occurs in some of its buildings throughout other areas outside of Rome. This is a Roman theater at a place called Sabratha in North Africa. And so when you take a look at this, think about what are some features that are very distinctly Roman. What about this building, even though it's not whole, it's been preserved as best as it could be. But it's not intact. But you can take a look at this building and see perhaps some features that are distinctly Roman in its architecture. So one of the things that you can look at that might indicate some Romanization that's going on in this area is that we see, for one thing, this is a Roman theater, and this is a very Roman structure. In which plays were put on, but it's likely built out of local materials, so this is a very red stone that's being used. It also celebrates the wealth of the local area with grandeur and size, but as a theater, the celebration takes on the Roman form. Now, why do you suppose such an expensive, elaborate theater was built in North Africa so far from Rome? Some possibilities for answering that question are that the theater may have been built to keep the provinces happy. So remember that even though it's far away from Rome, this doesn't mean that there aren't any Romans there. And as Romans are mixing with other cultures, they're introducing features of their culture, and there's a lot of cultural exchange going on. This is a two-way street of cultural exchange. And so Romans built some of these structures throughout the Roman Empire. They built a lot of these types of structures, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and if you ever want to see a good example of how that happened, Israel has a lot of really well-preserved Roman ruins, Roman remains of buildings that demonstrate this. And one of the most interesting places to see how this occurred is at Caesarea on the Mediterranean. There is a large amphitheater there. And so it's a very interesting place. A lot of Roman buildings still remain. And there's even an arena for chariot races. And so some things that might have been occurring here is that this is, as Romans are spreading throughout the world, throughout the Western world, there's a distinct desire to sort of recreate Roman culture, but as this Roman culture is being recreated in these other places to satisfy the wants of the Romans living there, they're being subtly changed a little bit. They're becoming fairly unique. They're not purely Roman. They're not purely local. They're a synthesis of the Roman and the local. This kind of a structure also highlighted the importance of public spectacle, and it helped to spread Roman culture at what was then an important trading center. So Sabratha, there were a lot of products going through Sabratha. There were a lot of Romans living there. There was a lot of interaction between these different cultures. So this was an important place. And as a reflection of its importance in trade between Rome and these different societies, you would find structures like this because it reflected the grandeur and the elegance and made a statement about the importance of that area. Now we're going to go back over to the eastern end of the Mediterranean. We're going to go back and talk about the Hebrews, the descendants of the Hebrews again, because we're going to have the emergence of a very influential religion that comes out of that area, and this is going to profoundly change the Western world. So Jewish apocalypticism arose out of persecution and the expectation that a Messiah would come to deliver the Jewish people, as well as provide final judgment and justice. And so this was a movement. You could call it a movement, and it was one in which Jewish people they looked to this idea of a Messiah as someone who would free them from what was viewed as slavery. They didn't like being under Roman dominion. They wanted to be independent. And so you see these movements coming up in Israel in response to what was seen as an unbearable situation. Unpopular leadership installed by the Romans, think Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 to 4 BCE. These leaders tended to ignore Jewish law, and they heightened apocalyptic tensions. Herod was not a popular leader at all. He was seen as being a Roman puppet. So Jesus was a teacher and a healer during the reign of Tiberius. This is according to the New Testament Gospels, which were composed between 70 and 90 CE. After his baptism by John, who preached repentance before a final judgment, Jesus traveled the Judean countryside, urging people to prepare for the coming of God's kingdom. He taught about God's love for humanity and the responsibility of all people to love one another. This is a shift in the way of thinking that characterized the people in this area. But it did reflect other Jewish teachings. In Jerusalem, his preaching, along with miraculous healings and exorcisms, led Jewish authorities to fear he might want to replace them. And so with that fear of Jesus leading a Jewish revolt against Jewish authorities as well as Rome, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate ordered his crucifixion in Jerusalem in 30 CE, and he did that in collaboration with local leaders to a certain extent. There's a lot of debate today, and it gets mixed up in a lot of politics. There's a lot of debate today over responsibility, and really these are Not important issues to us here, because oftentimes what begins to happen is that this gets caught up in sort of a blame game, and so I want you to avoid the tendency to do that. There have been unfortunate things that have resulted from trying to play that game, and so it's important just to really focus on the history of this time period and not get caught up in these politics. Jesus' followers reported that God had raised him from the dead, and some Jews followed his 12 apostles, who were led by a man named Peter. Another man named Paul, who was from Tarsus, he was a Jewish Roman citizen, and he had opposed the movement. In fact, if you've read the New Testament at all, Paul was known for persecuting the followers of Jesus. However, he converted after what he reported as a divine revelation. He then went on to travel throughout the Mediterranean world, spreading the message that Jesus was divine and had been crucified as a sacrifice for the sins of humanity. Paul helped to establish Christianity as a separate and distinct from Judaism. And one of the ways that he did this was by allowing converts to dispense with Jewish rites and dietary laws, and this was very controversial. This resulted in tension between him and Jewish authorities, as well as some of Jesus' followers. Not everybody agreed with him. Paul was then arrested and executed by Roman authorities as a troublemaker around 65 CE. A Jewish revolt against Roman authority in 66 CE ended in the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. The loss of the Jewish ritual center further separated Christianity from Judaism. And remember, again, I talked about Masada at the beginning of the section on the Roman Republic, and that event, Masada, the siege of Masada, is all mixed up in these events of this time period. Now, this kind of gives you an idea of what Israel looked like at the time. It was called, the map labels it as Palestine in the time of Jesus, around 30 CE. And don't get too caught up in what the name of this area is. Just know what it looked like. And what the major cities are. That's the most important feature. And so that area in green, the Galilee, this would have been the area in which Jesus was most active. But you'll see that Jerusalem is a little bit further to the south. He was also very active there as well. Now, Christianity as a new religion was suspect in Rome, and Christian practices led to false accusations of promiscuity and cannibalism. Because Christians refused to participate in public ritual, they were often blamed for disasters. And persecutions such as those enacted by Nero after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE they might have been infrequent, but they were terribly brutal. So brutal that I think in the minds of Westerners, they seem to have been more prolific than they really in actuality were. Christianity itself was not illegal, but Christians could be punished in the name of preserving order, particularly if they refused to honor the traditional gods. Christians were sometimes punished so cruelly that some Romans actually became sympathetic to them. And you'll see this in the stories of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, that these are women who did lose their lives. But what I want you to remember when you're reading those documents, just because you were Christian did not necessarily mean that you were going to be persecuted. It very much depended on the political climate of the day. It also very much depended on how perhaps open you were about your descent from Rome. That could very much come into play. However, martyrdom martyrdom was seen as an ideal. However, most Christians did not pursue it. It was very limited to a few individuals. But this idea of a martyrdom actually helped fuel Christianity's growth, and it strengthened its core belief that suffering brought Christians closer to God. Christianity's transition from an apocalyptic sect to an enduring church was marked by doctrinal divisions. These divisions spurred the establishment of hierarchical authority, and what that looked like was a church headed by bishops originally appointed by the apostles. And so this is an interesting development because it's going to change the way that Christianity functioned. Prior to this period, early Christianity was made up of a very loose, you couldn't even really call it an organization, a very loose community of believers, of people who believed and followed Jesus. But as debates began to ensue about doctrine, about the nature of Jesus, about practice, you're going to see a response from Christians to decide some of these doctrinal disputes, and this led to the development of a hierarchy, of a leadership structure among Christians. So, as I've already said, at the head of this structure were bishops, and bishops had the authority to define doctrine and administer the growing church, as well as to ordain ministers and administer the sacraments. But disagreements, even with this response by Christianity to establish authority, disagreements over beliefs and doctrine continue to persist. Now, the history of women in the early church is a really interesting one, because in the early days of the church, there were a lot of leadership opportunities for women. They had significant authority in the church and actually exerted some power among followers. However, once we see the development of bishops demoted women from these positions of authority in the church, and many church leaders believed that women should be subordinate in the church just as they were in Roman society. So again, we see that as Christianity is interacting with Rome, some of Roman ideas concerning gender are beginning to influence the development of Christianity. In some places, women remained in leadership roles, but we also see that female celibacy, which actually rejected these traditional roles of wife and mother, became a respected way to demonstrate devotion to Christ. And this became an avenue for some women who were seeking other ways to express their religiosity. And women are actually going to be pretty important in the development of ascetic communities. All right, so perhaps you're familiar with the catacombs of Rome. These were subterranean tunnels that were built beneath cities. There are catacombs in various places, the most famous of which are the catacombs in Rome. And this is a painting from the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome. And it's an interesting one because, again, we've been talking about the Romanization of cultures throughout the Roman world. And I want you to look at this and think about how this image is an indicator that there's some Romanization of Christian culture going on. So how is this image of Christ Romanized? So perhaps one of the things that you've keyed into is that this does not look like perhaps what you've come to expect of the image of Christ, at least as it's been portrayed by Western European cultures. It's a very different image, perhaps from what you're accustomed to, and this is very much a reflection of the culture in which it was produced. So in this particular painting, Christ's hair and his mode of dress are typical of Roman fashion, and the form of the painting itself is Roman. Now, why would Christians have painted this underground? Why even have catacombs? Why do you need to have a place to bury your dead, a place to gather? Why do you need such a structure? Now, in the early days, it could be very dangerous to be an early Christian. Because Christians were subject to persecutions, many of them met secretly in these underground catacombs. However, it is important to note that plenty of Christians celebrated their Christianity publicly, and some of those, while not everyone was punished, not everyone was put to death, some of those Christians who did practice their Christianity publicly were rather unrepentant martyrs for the religion. And I hope you get that from the stories of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. These are women who sought martyrdom. They were given, Perpetua in particular was given opportunities to not be martyred, and she resisted. She had a desire to be martyred. Okay, and so this map just gives you a sense of the distribution of Christian populations by the third century. You can see in the dark purple, you can see areas that had Christian majorities. In the light purple, you had areas that had strong Christian minorities, and in the hash marks, you can see other areas that had smaller Christian minorities. While in the tan, these are areas that did not have very many Christians at all. And as you take a look at this map, you can see in the red, from the red arrows, you can see some tracings of where Paul of Tarsus journeyed. And so you shouldn't be surprised that these areas would have strong Christian populations, whether they were the majority or the minority. These are areas that typically had strong Christian populations. All right, now we do have some competing religious beliefs, competing both to Rome and to Christianity. One of these was the cult of Isis. Isis was a popular Egyptian goddess with a wide following among Romans. She had a widespread appeal among many Romans. Her image as a loving mother to all mankind and her reputation for kindness and compassion combined with her promise to believers of life after death, and this added to her appeal. The worship of Mithras. Mithras was supposedly a god of Persian origin. This was a widespread cult, but it remains rather mysterious. It had, in the rituals of Mithras, it had secret initiations, secret rituals for followers, and you only knew about them if you had achieved certain levels. And interestingly enough, we don't have any kind of documentary evidence that has remained or survived that would give us any indication of what the religious practice of the cult of Mithras would have looked like. Apparently, people were really able to keep a good secret. It did very little we do know about it is that it apparently emphasized sacrifice and progression through a hierarchy of rankings, and that's about all we know about it, other than that it was a rather popular form of worship. So Greek philosophy guided many upper-class Romans, particularly Stoicism. This was a particularly popular philosophy among Romans, and it encouraged this incorporation of Greek philosophy into Roman society encouraged a life of self-discipline and duty. This was why it was so appealing to Romans, because these are values that they really idealized. Personal philosophies informed many individual systems of ethics. Christians and polytheists debated the appropriation of aspects of philosophy into their religious thought. Neoplatonism, in particular, it urged self-discipline and the rejection of physical life in order to focus on spiritual purity and union with God, and it had an influence on many Christians. Now, we're going to start to see some external pressures on the Roman Empire. Multi-ethnic bands from Northern Europe made regular incursions across the Danube and Rhine rivers to raid Roman territory. We shouldn't be surprised that Romans feared outsiders, outside threats, because they were subject to them quite frequently. The raids from these intruders became increasingly damaging. On the eastern edge of the empire, a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, defeated the Parthians and attempted to form a new Persian empire. This required the Romans to maintain a large defensive army on the Persian frontier. So again, this army is going to be very expensive to maintain. Emperors hired skilled Germanic warriors as auxiliary soldiers for the Roman army. It's going to become increasingly difficult for Rome to populate its army from Romans, especially as elite Romans find other ways to get out of serving in the Roman army. What Rome would do is they would hire these Germanic warriors as auxiliary troops, and they would settle them on the edges of the empire as buffers against other invaders. Pay and supplies for a growing military establishment, which was approximately 450,000 troops by the early 3rd century. This is huge. So these expenses of supporting a really large force, combined with the absence of conquests, meant that expenses outpaced economic growth. So the Roman Empire has entered this period of maintenance and somewhat of self-defense. This is leaving less opportunities for pillage, for getting treasure, and Rome is not as able to enrich itself from the enterprises of its army. On top of this, inflation drove up prices and was exacerbated when some emperors devalued coinage by putting less silver in each coin. This was a vain attempt to cut costs that set the stage for the full financial collapse of the empire. And so just so you can see some of these areas and how they're becoming fragmented, we have in pink, we have the Roman Empire, but in the yellow, we can see that by the 3rd century, the Gauls have control of those areas, with Spain mixed. So Emperor Septimus Severus's conquests after 193 CE led to high military expenditures. When he died in 211 CE, his son Caracalla murdered his brother and embarked on a spree of spending and oppression, another really unpopular Roman emperor. He raised the pay of the military, he raised the pay of the military and commissioned an array of large-scale public works, and so this was a very expensive endeavor. Caracalla opened citizenship to all non-slaves in an effort to raise money, but debt deepened nonetheless as expenses increased. He was not good at controlling his expenditures. Financial instability, in turn, generated a 50-year civil war, with 24 emperors, 24, seizing control of the throne during this time period. Most of them were military leaders with loyal troops at their backs. On top of that, we have some natural disasters, and we have some pressure from outsiders. Earthquakes and epidemics actually combined with declining agricultural production to reduce population and food supplies. This declining population was subject to a lot of illness and undependable food supplies, and this in turn weakened the state and the military. Weak frontiers encouraged foreign invasions, particularly from the Sassanids, which meant that imperial territory was in constant danger of being captured. Now, here's the repercussions for Christians. Many polytheists blamed Christians for the difficulties the empire was facing. Again, we've talked about this in previous units, that one of the characteristics that we frequently see with some of these civilizations that we've been talking about is there is a distinct connection being made between duties and obligations and the favor of the gods. And so Christians were perceived as not doing their duties, and this was in turn inspiring the gods to anger, to punish Rome. So Emperor Decius launched a systematic persecution. He reigned from 249 to 251 CE. He's one of these short timers. And he, in turn, vowed to restore the goodwill of the gods by doing so. So he, in his rhetoric, talked about punishing the Christians by persecuting them, and he perceived that this was going to bring back the goodwill of the gods, and Rome would be well from that point on. Many Christians were killed. A subsequent emperor, Gallienus, ordered Christians left alone. Persecuting the Christians didn't end Roman troubles, and he could see that, and so he decided that it didn't make any sense. However, the principate that was established by Augustus was at an end by the 280s. So all of these internal pressures, these natural disasters, these foreign enemies, as well as a series of poor leaders, is going to contribute to the end of the Roman Empire as it stood. And so we're going to see some changes occurring. And so just one last map. This is the Roman Empire in the 3rd century CE, by the end of this period that we've been talking about. And so you can just see, it just gives you a good idea of where these external pressures were coming from. And you can see these in the red arrows. We have a lot of groups that are attacking the Roman frontier, and this is putting a lot of pressure. And as population is declining, Rome not only is unable to produce resources, they're also unable to populate the army. They're having a hard time being able to muster enough troops to be able to stave off some of these pressures, to stave off some of these raids. So it's having some widespread repercussions for Rome.